Starfleet operates a dizzying diversity of starship types. Regardless of era, classifying every type used by Starfleet in its long history poses a significant challenge to enthusiasts, as Starfleet has lacked a consistent convention regarding their terminology throughout most of its history. And often, when an attempt to enforce such a system is made, it quickly falls apart into a myriad of variations within the scheme established. As a result, this video will not list every type of ship which Starfleet has ever operated, or classification rather, but instead attempt to merge those terms into a few select broader categories, and then list what they have been used for. The format which will be used will thus be a brief explanation of the broader category, how Starfleet uses the ships which fit within this category, and then a quick list of some of the more prominent variations of ships within these broad categories. With this explanation out of the way, we shall now look at our first broad category, the capital ship. The largest type of vessel operated by Starfleet, recently known under the designation Explorer, capital ships have historically been a rare sight in Starfleet's ranks, with the Federation typically eschewing such singularly military vessels in preference to larger numbers of smaller multi-mission types, such as cruisers and frigates. This is not to suggest, however, that the few such ships which have entered Starfleet service have been any less capable than their foreign peers, with ships such as the Federation and Galaxy class easily being contenders for the most powerful vessels in service at the time of their introduction. Like in other navies, capital ships, whether called battleships, dreadnoughts, command cruisers, or the more benign Explorer, are meant to serve as the spear point of Starfleet battle fleets and task forces, fighting where the action is thickest and the risk greatest. They are flagships, status symbols, and, for the citizens of the Federation, visible proof that their government's commitment to their security from any threats which might harm them is serious and more than mere words. Below capital ships, we have, perhaps, the most diverse category of Starfleet vessels, these being the cruisers. At their larger end late in the period we are covering, shortly after the Dominion War, ships technically called heavy cruisers, like the Galaxy and Sovereign classes, both of which are also known under the category Explorer, are in reality capital ships called cruisers for political reasons. Generally, though, the cruiser is the standard mid to small general-purpose vessel within Starfleet. Throughout its history, the cruiser has been the standby of Starfleet, with the speed and range to quickly respond to emergencies in the colonies, and the firepower to stand against most threats to Federation security. The ships can also serve as long-range explorers, and indeed this is, in many cases, their primary mission. Typically, cruisers operate on their own for prolonged periods, but they can also serve together in a fleet or squadron. A huge number of cruiser designations have been used by Starfleet over the years, with heavy, light, battle, attack, scout, support, and exploration cruisers all serving in the fleet actively at various points. Below the cruisers, we have the broad category of escorts. These are typically smaller ships meant to serve in the roles of border patrol, law enforcement, work as part of a fleet as a screen or strike element, and of course escort larger ships or merchant vessels. Many specialized types exist, with the frigate being a particularly diverse category that over time has taken many forms, with ships such as the compact Norway class and large New Orleans class both being labeled frigates, though one is more properly a cruiser. Frigates began life as a smaller counterpart to the cruiser following the Romulan Wars in the 22nd century, but have constantly changed and adapted their forms over the years. After frigates, we have the destroyer, a type which became very much in vogue during the Cold War with the Klingon Empire, and was built in large numbers. with the Saladin and Akulla classes being especially numerous examples of the type. But the term destroyer has fallen out of favor in recent decades as Starfleet shifted towards a more peacekeeping role within the Federation, with the term escort being used to denote many ships that would have previously bore the destroyer designation. After this, we have the corvette. Starfleet tends not to employ any ships bearing the corvette designation. It's a term you tend to see applied to smaller ships in use by foreign navies and pirates instead, with Orion raiders occasionally bearing the corvette designation, as well as numerous other examples of ships from other races that border the Federation. And to round out the list of Starfleet combat vessels, we come to the Scout designation. Scouts are typically very small, fast, and long-legged ships. Typically lacking much in the way of firepower, Scouts are meant to act as the eyes and ears of a fleet in times of war. While in peace, they are used to blaze new trails and discover new items of interest for larger cruisers to study in detail at a later date. Having the least amount of variation in size or role, the Scout type has fallen out of fashion in recent years as Starfleet began to send more cruisers on long-term missions of exploration during the early 24th century. Starfleet combat doctrine has adapted and changed significantly over the centuries of its existence in response to the constantly shifting series of threats and missions given to it. In its early days, it could be said that Starfleet combat doctrine was a joke analogous to military intelligence. In its early years, the organization seldom worked at anything above single-ship level, the fleet being too thinly spread and the threats too limited to encourage the development of anything approaching a single-fleet combat doctrine. This began to change as potential threats to the Federation grew in the early 23rd century, with the Klingon Empire being nearly solely responsible for much of Starfleet's early expansion and renewed focus on combined fleet operations. By the 4 Years' War, Starfleet had begun developing a doctrine for ships working at the squadron level, with vessels cycling through regular periods of training, patrol, and exploration deployments. This limited training would quickly prove inadequate as small Starfleet squadrons contended with much larger and better organized Klingon forces, which drove deeply into Federation territory before they eventually ran out of momentum and reached the limits of their supply lines. In the early war, the small cruisers operated by Starfleet quickly proved to be too limited for combat in major fleet actions, leading to a rushed design program to construct new ships and a new, proper combat doctrine by the middle of the war. Starfleet began to make significant progress and turn back the tide and later advanced to retake the territories lost to the Klingons early on, by the war's end reoccupying the pre-war border. Post-war, Starfleet would develop the doctrine which would guide its tactical thinking forward for the next century or more, establishing multiple permanent fleets, squadrons, and flotillas of vessels in addition to the typical pre-war ad hoc formations which still remained on the frontier. With fleets and task forces established and based in key strategic areas to guard and defend their sectors acting as the focal point of defense, the rest of the fleet was assigned on single-ship tasks to patrol or explore as needed. It would be this system that would serve the Federation well during the rest of the 23rd century and into the 24th, Starfleet being able to effectively respond to the many threats which emerged in the period. It would only be with the onset of the Dominion War in the 2370s that this system would change in favor of even larger, more fixed formations with a more rigid command structure imposed. These formations would greatly smooth over command issues during fleet combat as the war went on. Post-war, the fleet has returned to the looser, less official, and more flexible system which had served Starfleet well, though official mobilization plans returning to massed formations and fleets are on the books and regularly practiced by the fleet to keep readiness levels high in the event of a future conflict. With centuries of experience and the most advanced tech base in the region behind them, Starfleet has proven consistently capable of adapting to and overcoming any threat which has arisen to the lives and property of the Federation's citizens it is tasked with defending. Time and time again managing to do so with a mixture of improvisation, honed instinct, and training that few other military forces in the galaxy can match.